His heart is failing! We have no match! He's going to die!
I'm calling Odessa Vance. She's the only one who can save him.
After what we did, she'll never answer.
We need you to come back in tonight. It's an emergency. 6 weeks earlier, those same people hadn't had a single word to spare for her when they walked her out of the building with a box of her belongings and a story that wasn't true. Now her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her name was Odessa. 2 months ago, she'd been one of the most trusted surgical nurses in the hospital's cardiac unit. Then a medication error that wasn't hers got quietly pinned on her file, and instead of asking questions, the hospital's administration decided the easiest fix was to make her disappear from the schedule. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, get comfortable, because this is one of those stories that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Odessa almost didn't answer the third call. She'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding a version of her life that didn't need that hospital in it, working private shifts, telling herself she didn't miss the place that had thrown her away so easily. But something in the nurse manager's voice on the other end, tight, almost desperate, made her pick up anyway. "It's Mr. Beck," the voice said. "Junho Beck. He collapsed 2 hours ago. We need a transfusion match for surgery, and yours is the only compatible profile in the entire database." Odessa knew the name. Everyone in that city knew the name. Junho Beck ran one of the largest shipping conglomerates in the region, the kind of man whose face showed up on business news segments she usually scrolled past without much interest. She'd crossed paths with him exactly once, months earlier, during a routine post-op visit she barely remembered him for. What she did remember, standing in her kitchen at 11 at night, with her old hospital's number still glowing on her phone screen, was every version of the last conversation she'd had with that hospital's administration. The careful, rehearsed apology that wasn't really an apology. The silence when she asked who actually gave the wrong dosage order. The box of her belongings waiting by the door before she'd even finished making her case. She thought about hanging up. She thought about it for longer than she expected to. But there was a man on an operating table somewhere in that building right now who had nothing to do with what was done to her, whose life depended on a blood type so rare the hospital had apparently searched every donor record they had before landing on hers. Whatever she felt about the people asking her for help, the man dying in that hospital bed wasn't the one who'd wronged her. "I'll come," she said, "but we're going to talk about what happened to me after this is over." There was a pause on the other end, long enough to tell her the answer to that wasn't going to be simple. She grabbed her coat anyway, because that was who she was, and some decisions had never actually been about what she was owed. But let this be clear before the story moves any further. The same hospital that discarded her without a second thought now needed her more than it had ever needed anyone. And by the time this night was over, more than one buried truth was going to be dragged into the light. Not just about a blood match, but about exactly who had engineered her downfall and why. Odessa had spent 11 years building a reputation inside that hospital, most of it in the cardiac surgical unit, where the margin for error was thin enough that a single mistake could cost a life. She was the nurse other nurses asked to double-check their calculations when something felt off. Surgeons requested her by name for the cases that made everyone else nervous. She'd built that reputation slowly, the way most real things get built, through thousands of ordinary shifts nobody remembered individually. She hadn't planned on staying in that city as long as she had. She'd moved there for the job, knowing almost no one, and over the years, the hospital had become the closest thing she had to a community, people she trusted, a routine that gave her life shape, a sense that the work she did mattered to more than just a paycheck. The trouble started with a patient named Mr. Choi, a man recovering from a valve replacement whose medication order got altered somewhere between the attending physician's notes and the pharmacy. Odessa caught the discrepancy before it reached the patient, flagged it through the proper channels, and documented everything exactly the way she'd been trained to. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Weeks later, a different patient on the same floor suffered a serious reaction to a medication error, one that had nothing to do with Odessa's shift or her patient's. But in the scramble to explain the incident to the hospital board, someone needed a name attached to a pattern of carelessness, and Odessa's earlier flagged discrepancy, the one she'd actually caught and prevented, got quietly rewritten into evidence against her instead of proof of her diligence. She didn't understand what was happening until it was already too late to stop it. The hospital's director of nursing, a woman named Precious Aduba, sat across from her in a small office and explained, in a calm and almost sympathetic voice, that the board needed accountability and that Odessa's file made her the simplest explanation. "This isn't personal," Precious told her. "It's about protecting the department's credibility." Odessa asked more than once why the actual timeline didn't support what they were accusing her of. She asked to see the incident report. She asked who had actually altered Mr. Choi's original order in the first place. Every question got the same answer, dressed up in slightly different language. The decision had already been made above anyone in that room's ability to change it. What Odessa didn't know yet, what she wouldn't learn until much later, was that the doctor whose actual error had triggered the second patient's reaction was someone with connections the hospital board had no interest in examining too closely. It was easier, cleaner, and far less costly to attach the blame to a nurse with no family in the city and no lawyer on retainer than to risk exposing a physician whose family sat on committees that controlled hospital funding. She was demoted first, moved off the cardiac floor to a rotating position with half her previous responsibilities. When she pushed back, quietly but persistently, the demotion became a termination 3 weeks later, framed carefully enough that it wouldn't look retaliatory to anyone who didn't already know the full story. She left with a box of her things and a severance agreement she signed without fully reading, because by then she'd stopped believing anyone in that building intended to be fair with her, and she needed the money more than she needed the fight. She built a private nursing practice in the weeks that followed, taking home care clients directly, cutting the hospital out of her life the way you cut out something that's already caused enough damage. She told herself she was done with that place. She had no idea that a rare blood type buried somewhere in an old donor record was about to pull her right back into the middle of it. Junyubak had collapsed in his office a little after 7 that evening, according to the story making its way through the hospital by the time Odessa arrived. His assistant found him on the floor of his private conference room, unresponsive, and called an ambulance without hesitation. By the time he reached the hospital, the surgeons already suspected an aortic complication that would require immediate surgery. The complication was severe enough, and his blood loss significant enough, that the surgical team needed a transfusion match ready before they could safely proceed. That was where the emergency turned into a crisis. Junho's blood type carried a rare antigen combination, one that made standard donor matching nearly useless. The hospital's blood bank didn't have compatible units on hand, and appeals to the regional blood network turned up nothing usable within the window his surgeons believed he had left. Someone in hematology, going through old donor records in a last attempt to find any lead at all, found Odessa's name flagged from a voluntary donor drive she'd participated in years earlier, back when she still worked there. Her profile matched Junho's rare type almost perfectly. That was how Precious Aduba ended up making the call that night, the same woman who had sat across from Odessa months earlier and explained, calmly, why the hospital needed to sacrifice her career to protect its reputation. Precious didn't mention any of that on the phone. She spoke only of the emergency, of the man's family waiting outside the operating room, of how little time there was to find another option. Odessa arrived at the hospital a little after midnight, badgeless, no longer an employee, walking through doors she never expected to walk through again. The lobby was full of people connected to Junho's company, board members and assistants speaking in hushed, anxious clusters, none of them aware of who she was or what she'd once meant to that building. Precious met her near the entrance, thinner and more tired-looking than Odessa remembered, and walked her through what the surgical team needed without quite managing to look her in the eye for more than a few seconds at a time. "You understand what you're doing," Precious said. "This isn't just a donation. If the surgery is successful because of you, that's going to be visible. People will ask questions." "They should have asked questions 6 weeks ago," Odessa said, "about a lot of things." Precious didn't answer that. She led Odessa to the lab instead, where the transfusion process began within the hour, blood drawn carefully under the supervision of a physician who kept glancing at Odessa like she was trying to place her face. Junho's family arrived shortly after, his older sister first, sharp-eyed and visibly exhausted, asking pointed questions about who this donor was and why the hospital hadn't had a backup plan already in place. Odessa answered what she could, kept the rest to herself, and watched the family's guarded politeness settle into something closer to gratitude once the surgical team confirmed the transfusion had gone as needed. The surgery itself lasted just under 6 hours. Odessa stayed in the waiting area longer than she needed to, telling herself it was only to make sure the transfusion held, though some part of her also wanted to see, with her own eyes, whether the outcome of tonight would matter to anyone in that building beyond the immediate crisis. When the lead surgeon finally emerged, visibly relieved, and announced that Junho had made it through the procedure and was expected to recover, a ripple of relief moved through the waiting room. Precious exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Odessa felt something different. Relief, yes, for a man she barely knew, but underneath it, quietly, the beginning of a decision she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet, that she wasn't leaving this hospital again without answers about exactly what had been done to her and exactly who had decided it was necessary. Junho asked to meet the donor 3 days after his surgery, once he was stable enough to sit up and hold a conversation without exhausting himself. Nobody on his team expected him to recognize her, and for a moment he didn't. Then something in his expression shifted. "You treated me after my gallbladder surgery last year," he said. "You were the one who caught that my pain medication dosage was wrong before it reached me." Odessa hadn't expected him to remember that. It had been a small moment in a long shift, the kind of thing she did dozens of times a year without a second thought. But he'd apparently held on to it, filed it away the way people sometimes file away the moments when someone paid closer attention to them than they expected. "I don't work here anymore," she told him, because it felt important that he know that before this went any further. His sister, a sharp and deliberate woman named Grace Beck, who ran significant parts of the family's business alongside him, was in the room for that conversation and didn't miss the way Odessa said it. "Why not?" Grace asked. "A nurse who catches errors other people miss doesn't usually end up unemployed by accident." Odessa told them the short version, the version she'd told herself so many times it had started to feel rehearsed. A patient's reaction, a demotion, a termination dressed up in language designed to survive scrutiny. She didn't ask for anything in return for telling it. She hadn't come back into that hospital expecting sympathy from the family of the man she'd helped save. Grace, however, wasn't the kind of person who let a detail like that pass without pulling at the thread. Within a day, she'd requested Odessa's personnel file from the hospital administration, citing the family's interest in understanding the full circumstances of their brother's care team. The hospital, eager to keep the Bakic family satisfied after everything that had happened, complied faster than they might have for anyone else asking. That request didn't sit well with Precious Aduba, who understood exactly what kind of scrutiny it could eventually lead back to. She reached out to Odessa directly, this time in person rather than over the phone, meeting her outside the hospital rather than inside it. "I know this looks complicated," Precious said, but dragging up the details of your termination right now, while Mr. Bake is still recovering, isn't going to help anyone. It could look like you're trying to use this situation for your own benefit. I'm not the one who called Grace Beckick's attention to my file, Odessa said. You did that when you handed it over. Precious didn't have an answer for that. What she did have a few days later was an offer, Odessa's old position back, with a modest increase in pay and a quiet note in her file correcting the record, on the condition that she let the matter end there, without pushing for a full account of who had actually altered Mr. Choi's original medication order. It was, on paper, more than Odessa had expected to get out of any of this. It solved the immediate problem. It gave her back a version of the career she'd lost, but it also meant leaving in place whoever had actually caused the original error, the person the hospital had protected instead of her, still working somewhere in that building without having to answer for any of it. Odessa didn't give Precious an answer that day. She told her she needed time to think about it, and she meant it, because for the first time since this had all started, she had leverage she hadn't had before. A grateful, influential family paying close attention to how the hospital treated the woman who'd saved their brother's life. What she didn't yet know was how close that attention was about to get to the name of the person actually responsible for the mistake that had cost her everything. Grace Beck didn't do anything quietly. That became clear to Odessa about a week after their first conversation, when Grace requested a private meeting and arrived with a folder thick enough that Odessa understood immediately this wasn't going to be a simple courtesy visit. I had someone look into the incident you mentioned, Grace said, sliding the folder across the table. The one involving the medication reaction. It wasn't hard to find once someone actually looked instead of accepting the hospital's summary. Inside were copies of the original medication order for Mr. Choi, the one Odessa had flagged and corrected months before the unrelated incident that got pinned on her. Alongside it were internal messages obtained through channels Grace didn't explain and Odessa didn't ask about, showing that the physician responsible for the second patient's reaction wasn't unknown to hospital leadership at all. The name attached to the actual error was Dr. Hyun-woo Song, a cardiologist whose father sat on the hospital's board of directors and whose family had donated the funding for an entire wing of the building 3 years earlier. Odessa sat with that for a long moment. She'd suspected, in the vague way people suspect things they can't prove, that her demotion had less to do with her actual performance and more to do with protecting someone the hospital had more invested in. Seeing the name in writing was different from suspecting it. Precious Aduba knew this, Grace said. There's an email in there from her to the board, dated 2 days before your termination was finalized, recommending you as the, and I'm quoting her words here, lowest risk option for resolving the incident quickly. Odessa read the email twice. Lowest risk option. She sat there long enough that Grace eventually spoke again, gentler this time. You don't have to decide what to do with this today. But Odessa already knew what it meant, even before she decided what to do about it. It meant every conversation with Precious had been exactly what it felt like. Not a mistake made under pressure, but a calculated decision, weighed and chosen, because Odessa was the option that would cost the least. Not the truth, the convenience of the truth. She thought about Dr. Seong, a man she'd worked alongside for years, someone she'd nodded to in hallways, someone whose patients she'd cared for without a second thought about his name or his family's donations. She thought about how easily her 11 years had been set against his father's board seat and found lighter. Does Junho know any of this? Odessa asked. Not yet, Grace said. I wanted you to see it first. It's your story before it's his family's business to fix. That distinction mattered to Odessa more than Grace probably realized. She hadn't donated her blood, hadn't walked back through those doors, so that a powerful family could hand her justice wrapped up as a favor. If this came out, She needed it to come out, because the truth deserved to, not because the Bakes had decided to intervene on her behalf. But she also understood, sitting there with the folder open in front of her, that she couldn't undo this on her own. Precious Aduba had a hospital board behind her, a physician's powerful family protecting him, and a severance agreement with Odessa's signature already on file, agreeing not to pursue further claims against the hospital. She had the truth now. What she didn't have yet was any certainty that the truth would be enough, once it went up against everyone with a reason to keep it buried. "I need to think about how I want to do this," Odessa said finally. "Not just that I'm going to." Grace nodded, closing the folder but leaving it on the table between them. "Take the time you need, but don't take too long. Precious already offered you your job back. That offer has an expiration date, and once you sign anything else, this folder becomes a lot harder to use." Odessa left that meeting with something she hadn't carried in months. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of a decision that was finally, fully her own to make. Odessa didn't sign anything right away, and the silence didn't sit well with Precious Aduba. Within days, the tone of their conversations changed. What had once sounded like an olive branch now carried an edge Odessa hadn't heard before. "I'd think carefully before you decide to make this complicated," Precious told her, over the phone this time, her voice controlled in a way that felt more like a warning than concern. "Reopening this means reopening everything, your file, the severance agreement you signed. There are things in that file that could look worse for you than you're remembering." It was a vague threat, but Odessa understood exactly what it was reaching for. She'd signed documents in the chaos of losing her job that she hadn't read as carefully as she should have, and she had no way of knowing, without a lawyer of her own, what language might already exist that could be used against her if she pushed too hard. Word of the folder Grace had compiled reached the hospital board faster than Odessa expected and faster than Grace had intended. Someone on the inside had talked. Within a week, Dr. Song's family had retained legal counsel, and letters began arriving at Odessa's home address, carefully worded, never quite threatening outright, but making clear that any public statement she made about the original incident would be treated as defamation unless she could produce airtight proof. She had the folder Grace gave her. She didn't have the confidence, without money for a lawyer of her own, that it would hold up the way she needed it to. Worse, her private nursing clients started thinning out. 2 dropped her within the same week, one citing scheduling conflicts, the other not offering a reason at all. Odessa suspected, though she couldn't prove it, that someone had made calls on behalf of people who preferred she stay quiet and financially unstable, rather than confident and vocal. For the first time since this had all started, she considered simply taking Precious's offer. Her old job, her old pay, a corrected file, and an end to a fight that was beginning to cost her more than she'd budgeted for. She sat with the offer letter on her kitchen table for 2 full days, the same table where she'd once sat staring at her phone, deciding whether to answer that first call. She thought about Mr. Choi, the patient whose case had started all of this, and wondered whether anyone had ever told him the truth about what almost happened to him. She thought about every nurse who might come after her, blamed for a mistake that wasn't theirs because it was cheaper than protecting someone with the right last name. Junior, still recovering, sensed something was wrong before anyone told him directly. He asked Grace pointedly why Odessa had stopped returning his calls, and Grace, unwilling to lie to her brother, told him everything. The folder, the pressure campaign, the quiet unraveling of Odessa's already fragile stability. Junior, still weak from surgery, insisted on seeing Odessa in person. When she arrived, he looked at her with none of the polished composure she remembered from the business segments she used to scroll past. "They're trying to bury this the same way they buried it the first time," he said, "and I'm the reason it worked. My hospital, my board, My family's money, sitting on the other side of this. Odessa didn't correct him. She let the silence between them sit, because for once, someone with actual power in that building was finally saying it out loud, instead of dressing it up in careful language. I don't know what I want to do yet, she admitted. I don't know if I have the strength left to fight people with that much money behind them. Junho didn't offer easy reassurance. He simply said, You already fought harder than anyone gave you credit for, just by walking back through those doors the night I collapsed. I'd like the chance to help you finish it the right way, if you'll let me. It wasn't a solution. It was, for the first time in weeks, an offer that didn't come with a threat attached to it. Junho's offer put Odessa in a position she hadn't expected to find herself in, deciding not just whether to fight, but whose help she was willing to accept while doing it. She turned him down at first. I don't want this to become a story about you saving me, she told him. That's not what happened. I came back because a man needed a transfusion. What happens next needs to be mine. Junho respected that more than she expected him to. Then let me offer something different, he said. Not rescue, resources. A lawyer who reports to you, not to my family. Whatever documentation my company's compliance team can help verify. You decide how it's used. You decide when. It was a narrower kind of help, one that didn't ask her to hand her fight over to someone else, and after several days of turning it over in her mind, she accepted it on those terms. The lawyer Junho connected her with, a careful, unhurried woman named Folasade Ilori, reviewed the severance agreement Odessa had signed months earlier and found exactly what Precious had been counting on Odessa, never checking closely. A clause discouraging further claims, but nothing in it that prevented Odessa from disclosing factual information about patient safety incidents to a hospital licensing board. The threats implied in Precious's calls had counted on Odessa's fear, not on the actual strength of the paperwork. With that clarity, the real choice in front of Odessa came into focus. She could pursue this quietly, through licensing boards and internal channels, protecting her privacy, but risking a slow process that powerful families were skilled at outlasting. Or she could make it public, through Grace's connections, through the same board dinner where Dr. Song's father would be presiding within days, guaranteed to be witnessed by people who couldn't simply make the story disappear afterward. The quiet path was safer. The public path meant burning any chance of rebuilding a quiet life inside that hospital system ever again. She thought about the offer still sitting unsigned on her kitchen table, the version of her life where she went back to her old position, took the corrected file, and let Dr. Seong's family continue exactly as they had been. She thought about how many other nurses, aides, and junior staff might already understand, without anyone saying it aloud, exactly whose mistakes were allowed to exist and whose weren't. I want it public, she told Folasade, and then, more quietly, to herself. I'm done making this easy for people who never once made anything easy for me. Junyo, when she told him her decision, didn't try to talk her out of it, even knowing what it would likely cost his own family's relationship with the hospital's board, and with the Song family specifically. You understand what this does to my family's standing with them, he said, not as a warning, but as a genuine question. I do, Odessa said. I'm not asking you to protect me from that. I'm asking if you're still willing to stand next to me once it happens. Junho didn't answer right away. When he did, it wasn't a grand declaration. It was simple and steadier than she expected. I already decided that the night you walked back through those doors for a man who owed you nothing. The board dinner was an annual event, the kind meant to celebrate the hospital's donors and its most influential physicians, held in a banquet room usually reserved for exactly the sort of polished, uneventful evenings the Song family had built their reputation attending. Odessa hadn't been invited. She came anyway, with Grace beside her and Folasad's documentation in a folder she'd carried the entire drive over, hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised her. Junior, still recovering but well enough to attend against his doctor's mild objection, walked in beside them. His presence alone drew attention before anyone said a word, the man whose near death had dominated hospital gossip for weeks, upright and present at an event few had expected him to make. Dr. Song's father, chairman of the hospital board, was midway through opening remarks when Grace requested the floor, citing her family's recent experience with the hospital's care and her interest in publicly thanking the person responsible for her brother surviving it. It was a request no one in that room, least of all the chairman, felt comfortable refusing in front of the rest of the donors. Odessa didn't raise her voice when she spoke. She'd decided beforehand that this needed to sound like fact, not grievance, if it was going to land the way it needed to. She laid out the timeline plainly, the medication discrepancy she'd caught and corrected months before the incident that had actually harmed a patient, the internal email identifying her as the lowest risk option for resolving that unrelated incident, and the name of the physician whose error had caused it. She didn't need to raise her voice for the room to go still. Folasade had prepared copies of the key documents in advance, distributed quietly to a handful of board members whose support the chairman couldn't afford to lose in that moment. Dr. Seong, seated near the front, didn't deny it outright. He didn't need to. His father's face had already done that work for him, the practiced composure slipping in front of an audience he couldn't control the way he controlled hospital committees. The chairman attempted to redirect the room, framing this as a private personnel matter, better suited for another setting. But the room had already absorbed enough, and the reaction of the other board members, some visibly uncomfortable, a few outright angry at having been kept in the dark about a mistake covered up at a patient's expense, made clear that another setting was no longer an option that served the chairman's interests. Junior spoke last and briefly. He didn't need Grace's documents or Folasade's timeline to make his point land. "I'm alive because of the woman standing here," he said. "The same hospital that discarded her when she was inconvenient asked for her blood the moment it needed her. I think this room owes her more than gratitude. I think it owes her the truth, finally, told out loud." By the time the evening ended, the chairman had privately agreed, under pressure from board members, no longer willing to be associated with a cover-up now documented in writing, to reopen a formal review of both the original incident and Odessa's termination. Dr. Seong, standing within the hospital, quietly protected for years by his father's position, would not survive that review intact. It wasn't loud vindication, not in the way people sometimes imagine justice arriving, but for Odessa, standing in a room that had once decided she was expendable, it was enough. The truth, finally spoken where it couldn't be quietly filed away again. The formal review took 2 months to conclude, longer than Odessa expected, though Folasade had warned her these things rarely moved as fast as the moment that triggered them. When it finished, the findings were clear enough that the hospital had no real room left to protect anyone involved. Dr. Song resigned before the board could formally act against him, a resignation everyone in that building understood wasn't voluntary in any real sense. Precious Aduba's position was quietly restructured out of existence within the same month, the hospital's way of removing her without having to publicly admit exactly why. Odessa was reinstated with full back pay and, at Grace's quiet insistence during the review, a formal correction to her personnel file acknowledging that the original incident had never reflected any failure on her part. She didn't return to her old position exactly as it had been. She was offered, instead, a role helping redesign the hospital's incident reporting process, one meant to make it harder for a mistake to be pinned on the most replaceable person in the room ever again. She took the job, not because she needed the vindication of staying, but because she understood, more than most people in that building, exactly what needed fixing. Mr. Choi, the patient whose case had started the entire chain of events, reached out to her once the story became public, thanking her for something he hadn't fully understood he owed her until now. It was a small conversation, but it mattered to her more than most of the larger ones that followed. Junyo's recovery continued steadily in the months after the board dinner, and what began as gratitude between them slowly became something neither of them rushed to name too quickly. Grace, watching the two of them grow more comfortable around each other, only ever commented on it once, dryly, over dinner. "I did tell you resources, not romance. But I suppose I can't control everything." Odessa laughed at that more freely than she had in a long time. She didn't forget what those months had cost her, the sleepless nights, the fear of being erased twice by the same system, the long stretch where she genuinely believed the truth might not be enough. But she also didn't let that cost define what came after it. She'd walked back into a hospital that discarded her, expecting nothing from it, and left it having rebuilt not just her career, but the terms on which she was willing to accept a place inside it. If you made it this far, you already know this wasn't really a story about a blood match. It was about what happens when the people who decide you're expendable eventually need you more than you ever needed them, and what you choose to do with that moment when it finally arrives. If this one meant something to you, let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you want more stories like this, stay close, because there's another one already on the way.